This is Dr. Paul Witherell. Am I saying your last name correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST. We are very grateful to him for presenting today at 7:45 a.m. You're a mechanical engineer in the process engineering group of the Systems Integration Division. I'm not even keep going. That's a lot. I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself. Would you like to have questions throughout, or would you prefer that they wait till the end?
I guess if you don't mind, if you all just kind of raise your hand if you have a good question, I'm happy to stop and slow it down. My understanding is that we got an hour and 15 minutes. I've got 60 slides. Some of them I'll try to breeze through. Some of them you might find a little more interesting. Generally, we've gone a little bit back and forth on who the target audience was, so I'm not quite
Yep.
sure what
We have
remains.
We have some EIRs on this call. We have the majority of our landing zone entrepreneurs are on this call, and we have some YBI engine portfolio company founders. So a great mix. Everybody's very interested in this topic, but all I would say relatively beginner in this topic. Even I will speak for the majority of people. I don't want to speak for everybody. I'm sure Stephanie and Mike Breslin and a few others know a lot about it, but other than that, I would say we're all pretty newbies here.
Okay, great.
All right,
All right, I'll take
I'll
it
turn
from
the floor.
here. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Witherell. I've been at the National Institute of Standards and Technology for I actually just got my 15-year certificate. So for 15 years, I've spent 13 of it working on additive manufacturing. I've been the associate program manager and manager of our measurement science for additive manufacturing program for that entire time. I've led various projects, often are all focused on the data side of things, on the digital thread, digital twin type activities for folks that are familiar with that verbiage. So it's given me kind of a broad perspective on additive manufacturing, helped me become quite the expert, I guess, on additive manufacturing, particularly in powder bed fusion. And that's the knowledge that I'm bringing to the table today when we talk about more about the advanced manufacturing and quality certification, advanced manufacturing, the background I'm coming with. Right off the bat, I'd like to thank some of my colleagues, Duncan Gibbons and Alkin Donmez, who done some various presentations for different educational purposes and qualification in the past. So I've used some of their slides, incorporated a lot of my own, and I hope you all find today informative. So the outline that I'm be going through today, qualification, certification, acceptance, and advanced manufacturing. So I want to go over some of the terminology that becomes a huge kind of a roadblock in some of these discussions. Talk about uncertainty and qualification approaches and the role of regulatory agencies and regulatory guidance there. I'm then going to jump into additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing process, not necessarily the end all be all of advanced manufacturing process, but it's the one that I'm most familiar with, and there's actually one that a lot of people jump to when we talk about advanced manufacturing. We'll get to why when I get there. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about where I'm coming from, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and some of the roles that we play in this manufacturing environment. All right. So why is advanced manufacturing challenging? I mean, this is sort of where we're starting from, and this is, I guess, where motivation for my presentation, a big part of what I'm hoping to address in today's talk is, you know, qualification and certification. A lot of those things have been achieved and done for a very long time. We've had parts go to market for decades and decades and decades, and so it's not an insurmountable challenge. But when we put this word advanced in front of it, it's got a moving target, a moving name. And right now, there's actually a lot of activity in a lot of areas trying to figure out what advanced means to people now and what are the implications for having advanced in these qualification and certification processes. Advanced 50 years ago was different than advanced today. Advanced today is going to be different from advanced 50 years from now. So why today? Why is there so much more challenge in this advanced word now than there has been in the past? And a lot of it can be go back to digital. So advanced usually implies improved, but there's a lot of novelty that comes in there as well, right? The idea of, it's not necessarily established, it's advanced. So it's a little bit different, a little bit new. A lot of the times there's these increased capabilities. They're accompanied by increased parameters. And particularly when we again we'll talk about additive manufacturing, but when we talk about advanced now, we're often thinking about digitized, correct? A digital process, whether it's additive manufacturing or robotics, using those types of processes and being able to control things with a computer. We also think about, ceramics and composites a lot in advanced manufacturing, and those more advanced materials where, variabilities in how some of those materials can lay down can create, challenges or create, raise eyebrows a little bit and want to make sure, understand, increase the understanding about the process and what happened. So, when we have these increased capabilities, increased parameters, we don't have that same necessarily robustness because we can change a lot more things, we can pool things a lot more, and we can get different results. And so these types of things don't always benefit from the established norms. We can just go to the ES book and look at qualification using a material and some sort of heat treatment, but maybe we need some additional guidance. Solution qualification methods, they've proven difficult to adopt for AMTs, AMTs being advanced manufacturing technologies. All right, so this is one that kind of gets me, and I'll go through it real quick, or in a couple of minutes. I don't have all the answers for this. I said I've additive manufacturing, I've done a lot in, but when it comes to okay, well, when I think about qualification, talk about this. When I talk about certification, about this. So there's many different qualification definitions of qualification certification. It's not quite as bad as trying to argue about the definition of a digital twin, if anybody's done that yet. But there are different levels of kind of understanding, and there's different variations, different perspectives, different adoptions of these definitions. So right here are a couple of Wikipedia definitions: process qualification, qualification, manufacturing, production processes, conform and operate to a standard. Process validation is the analysis of data gathered. Certification is formal attestation to confirmation of certain characteristics of an object, person, organization. So, and those are Wikipedia definitions. And so those are some consensus type of things that have developed early on. Some of the ones that I'm going to kind of run with today or leverage, qualifications, process evaluate entity to determine whether it meets specified requirements of this phase of its life cycle. Entities are typically qualified components, material, machines, and processes and operations. So that's an important distinction that we'll get to, particularly when it comes to advanced manufacturing processes. This life cycle idea and the idea that we don't have to qualify for everything, but we qualify at a particular stage. Certification process evaluate an entity to determine if it meets specified technical requirements, is fit for service in a system, right? And so then you a little bit of the here, okay, qualification, certification, and I'll get to that slide in a couple of minutes. This typically involves a third party. And acceptance, and this is kind of where I kind of like to talk about it. Don't like get caught up in the terminology. The acceptance is the process of verifying the quantity of materials meet predetermined quality of standard specification for use in production. So acceptance is, okay, you got me something that's made the way that I can use it. And so this is good. Whether it's component, a material, or a lot, or something along those lines. So there's some, this is sort of kind of setting the stage for where we're going to a lot of the, why we have all these different codes and regulations and standards to do these types of things. And, it's a lot more than just saying the qualification and here's the standard to follow. There's a lot of different things that can be qualified, a lot of different things that can be certified. There's a lot of different aspects that go into the thought process and getting to, this stage that says something is good. And so here's a couple of, key terms that go into thinking about that. Stability and capability. Stability, we're looking for predictable. Capability, we're looking, towards consistency. And so when, we're talking about the qualification, certification, these are some things that kind of underpin those thoughts. The idea that every time we do something, it's not something brand new to us, but instead we're doing something, we're learning about it, we're being able to reproduce something, right? So the repeatability and reproducibility. Repeatability is saying, I'm repeat this process. I can repeat this creation. I can repeat these steps. So there's been something formalized, something's put in play that you can continue to engage, repeat, and observe and make happen. Reproducibility really focused on the outcome of there and the idea that, not only can I repeat the steps, but I can reproduce the outcome. And so when we get into the qualification, certification, and establishing procedures for those things, these are some fundamental ideas that we really need to establish. And again, this is another kind of core idea of what's going on when we talk about qual and cert and advanced manufacturing processes. as being to establish these fundamental concepts that will allow us to then get into the qualification certifications processes. And so, when we're working with a process, if you're creating a new process, if you're leveraging a new process, these are some of the terms and these are some of the fundamental principles that you want to start to put into play, because demonstrating these types of things are really going to be an important aspect of getting to that qual and cert. So, this is that slide that I said coming around here. When I talk about, qual, cert, I really want to talk about, creating something acceptable, creating something good, getting that repeatability, reproducibility, building that confidence and trust into the product process, feedstock material, whatever the case may be. And so when I'm, going through this presentation and I'm talking about, if you hear that see certification, a qualification, or acceptance, they all mean different things, and they all rightfully so mean different things. I'm really focused on, the idea of we're getting to something that somebody says, this is good enough, this is great, this is what we want, I can approve this. And so, whether we're talking about the qual, cert, acceptance, or one of those types of things, we're looking at the steps and the idea of getting comfort with something, building trust, and getting something to the stage where this is good, this is something I can prove. And so when we talk about meeting criteria for product acceptance, process acceptance, material acceptance, this is sort of what we're trying to get to. And so that's where I'm going with the terminology and moving towards that acceptance sides of things. Again, when I say acceptance, I'm talking about establishing those basic fundamentals. So in advanced manufacturing processes, there has been some success in qualification certification. So there are, again, I'm coming from an additive background, that for many advanced manufacturing technologies, we see composites. A lot of, again, composites is often considered an advanced manufacturing technology. We see composites adopted, flown, used for, multiple decades now, right? So when I was first getting to additive a decade ago, a lot of comparisons were made to composites at the time, because composites was introduced, 6 or 7 decades ago, and now they're in planes all the time. They're things that people are very comfortable with using, where the process still has a lot of variability into it, a lot of intricacy to it, but people feel comfortable enough with the process now where we see it adopted and implemented many times. Robotics is something that's definitely more about the process and the outcome of the process, where when we talk about robotics, it's usually a facilitator of creating something. But when we think about robotics, often we talk about advanced manufacturing processes. So that's more, a little getting different type of the process consistency. So this one, the qualification approaches, this is really focused. This one is based on additive manufacturing again, but it applies to kind of more general processes. And it's the idea of just demonstrating, and the qualification approach that is used and has been used well for different approval agencies, regulatory authorities as well, is just demonstrating that you can make one thing well. And so what happens is you have new designs, you're then asked to do new qualification processes. But when you have your parameter settings set to a certain way, you're able to consistently achieve certain material properties, right? And so we have your process parameter set to a certain way, you're able to repeat that process. And you can do that and show that over and over again, to the point where when you're creating that same part, you're able to get that same part. You can demonstrate that with first articles, you can demonstrate that with different sacrificial type of artifacts. But the idea there is you're building into the process for a particular part. And this one is kind of something that's been shown to work very well for the acceptance authorities. Is they understand that not everybody meets a mold. Not everybody has to be conformed to this mold. Not everybody is going to say, well, I can use this one and I can make what I have fit into that. They understand that doesn't work for everybody, and so they've made sure to create paths that say, we understand that yours is a little bit different, but we still need to have confidence that what you're creating is something that meets our standards. And this is, one of the traditional ways is that incremental confidence, the traditional building block approach. Another one that kind of goes along the same lanes is that incremental confidence approach. And so this one is maybe not necessarily the exact same, but the idea that, I can show you that I can do this much and get this. I'm only going to change change something a little bit over here. And so then the idea is that you've made a small change and you need to demonstrate that that small change is not going to throw everything off. And so that's the idea of starting to build confidence into aspects of your QualiCert process, aspects of your workflow that shows that, I can sub-process it or I can bring things down to a little bit different. Now I can demonstrate equivalence to here, and by making a small change, I can give you confidence that this is still going to meet what you need to have. You can still going to meet your acceptance criteria. And so that's, once you start to build that trust on your one process and you start to see that these small changes won't throw anything for a loop, there's things that you can do to do some modifications and again build that trust in. And these are again going into that one off, that idea of customization and meeting your QualiCert requirements, where not everybody has to fit into the mold or fit into that guidance, but when we're doing these AMTs, advanced manufacturing processes, sometimes you need to find that approach that works for what you're doing, what you're creating, and better understand how you can work with the regulatory agency, the approval, the certification authority that can take you to, that I understand this. This is what you need to show me, and once you can show me this, I'm going to feel comfortable with it. And it's building that trust and and both that initial sort of platform and incremental changes. And so one thing, and I'll jump on this further in the additive manufacturing section, is this IQ, OQ, PQ. And this is something where additive manufacturing is really been going down this, and some other folks have been being able to take this type of approach in doing the certification and doing the qualification side of things. And here is, very similar to that last one where I mentioned where we were talking about demonstrating equivalence at some step and then, doing some slight variations. But here we look to demonstrate competency in the different parts of the life cycle, the installation, the operation, and the performance qualification. So this isn't an approach I think that's gained some steam. It's definitely being developed and adopted in additive manufacturing more and more right now. I think it's gained general steam across the advanced manufacturing scope, and the idea that, we understand that, and when we say we, the folks that are now being presented with this information understand that it's hard to nail down everything for these things with large variability. So there's different ways that things can be broken down. And this approach looks at, again, that almost that life cycle stage, perspective stage, the installation, do we have a machine that can consistently operate in the same way? Do we have the same machine in multiple places? And so the idea of getting something running and making sure that one machine's capabilities are the same as another machine's capabilities, and setting that idea is at least that the capabilities of the machine is capable of doing something that is going to meet your acceptance criteria. Then the operational qualification, and that's looking at is the machine being used the same way? Are the processes being used the same way? Just because the machine has the same capabilities doesn't mean that people are able to take advantage of those capabilities the same way. And so by bringing that into play, you really start bringing into that process repeatability. You have machines with the same capabilities, and you operate the machines the same way. So you're getting consistent processes. And then the course, the next step goes into the performance. And so, okay, you've got the same processes, the same machines, the same processes. Are we getting that same part? Are we getting that reproducibility? And you know, there's different ways of breaking up the IQ and PQ. There's an MQ too as well, looking at the maintenance side of things. So just because it's set up one way doesn't mean it always stays that way. But this approach here is something it is emerging. It's emerged. It's fairly mature at this point now, I would say. I wouldn't say it's completely mature, but it's something that people have been successful in demonstrating. Here's how we can take a variety of things and start to build in our acceptance, our qual cert procedures based on this type of approach. So I guess that's where I'm going to stop on the kind of introduction to these basic qual cert type of things and what it is that we're trying to achieve, where is trying to get it. And so, based on my understanding of what the class is about is introducing you all to some of these basic concepts. So do we have any questions there? Are we comfortable? Yeah, please.
Hi, this is Sujit from Public Access. Sorry for
Okay.
that. So I wanted to find out, how does this align with the various other standards which are there? For example, let's say if you're making a part for aerospace purposes and then you have AS 9100 standards, you make parts for NASA and then you have NASA standards, and then you have ANSI and then you have ASTM. I understand the basic premise of IQ, OQ, PQ needs to be consistent, but how do they connect with one another? And is there any difference between any of these standards? And what do we need to do from a manufacturing standpoint to make sure we kind of align our processes to get the best outcomes?
I mean, see, you touch on some important questions, and I'm going to do, the standard dive is coming up, and actually the very next slide here is starting to look down those different guidances. And at the end of the day, a lot of times, just like in the Department of War, there's different requirements for the end user. And so it's hard for people to say that, you know, this one standard is not, there's barely a one size fits all, especially for something early on where folks need to feel like they need to understand, learn, develop their own guidance. So we have a lot of different guidance for those things, like you just pointed out, and I think the DOW led the way years ago, saying, we need consensus standards, we need public standards. We don't want a mill standard for every single thing. We want consensus standards, commercial standards that are pre-competitive, that we can say, this is an acceptable standard. And so those are still emerging for different processes. For additive manufacturing, we've been doing a lot of work over the years. Since back in 2014, we actually created a standards collaborative that was governed by ANSI that looks at all the different standards organizations that are developing standards in additive manufacturing and tries to make sure those are consistent. And so, I mean, what you just brought up is not something that's solved. I think it is really a challenge to the community and people that are involved in these standards, that they're challenged to now create solutions that can be adopted by many people. And so you want to develop good standards, robust standards, and I'll get to that later on in the presentation. But there is a lot of challenges today in trying to understand what the needs are of the different the certification authorities, different approval authorities, different agencies. And it's definitely not a one size fits all. And there's definitely a need to be familiarized with what the guidance is coming out of the different agencies and being able to understand, how they walk through that guidance, because there are different implications and different risks depending on what your final customer is going to be. I hope that, and I'll touch on the standards quite a bit more in later on in the presentation, but I hope that answers to some extent.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
All right. Well, I got plenty more slides here, so we'll keep on moving. So starting about those different guidances. And so I tried to break this up a little bit into the advanced manufacturing and the additive manufacturing, but a lot of my advanced manufacturing has come from the additive. And this is exactly that question that you just asked, right? So implications of acceptance. Qualification certification must meet stringent criteria. A lot of times when we're talking about qual and cert, there's a certain risk involved. And what that risk is really going to depend on that application. Sometimes in the DOW, the risk is, something blows up earlier that was going to blow up anyway. In the FAA, the risk might be, 200 people die. For NASA, it might be billions of dollars are lost. For the FDA, somebody might be uncomfortable, right? And so there's a lot of different risk associated with that, and there's a certain level of risk that people are willing to assume. But I think for the most part, when we talk about the qualification sort of things and the challenging ones, usually the people or the organizations that are doing these approval, they're not comfortable with a lot of risks because people can get hurt, people can die, and bad things can happen. And this is why we see traditional manufacturing process benefit from legacy. And so, I've had the the experience and been able to the great experience of working with a nuclear regulatory commission and a mutual MOU for about 6 years. And so it was eye-opening getting to understand some of their process. And I actually have this on the next slide, so I'll hold the rest of that story. But these established processes, they're their go-to. Hey, we've done this. It works. It's proven. You can do it. Proven is, and again, parts have been manufactured and certified for and this has been around since 1901, right? And so this manufacturing is not new, and you can get the four genes and what people learned from steel back in the Middle Ages. A lot of that still applies today, and that type of familiarity and understanding of fundamental materials has made people comfortable with a lot of with things as long as you're doing traditional processes like wrought. Castings and forgings came under challenge a while ago. People are more comfortable with that. When we talk about today's advanced manufacturing processes, things get a little bit more, we're not at that same comfort level. And so we really need to build confidence into these things. And confidence with uncertainties, confidence about understanding and understanding what these uncertainties can lead to. And so now I'm going to go with some of the guidance on how some of these regulatory authorities are kind of approaching this. And different agencies, organizations are developing guidance documents and doing their own thing. I'm going to go over some from NASA, FAA, FDA, and NRC. And so you're looking at space, aerospace, aeronauticals, FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So there you're looking at more on the medical side of things, and the NRCB and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so all of these are regulatory authorities, are regulatory authority, and they need to manage their risk and manage acceptability as much as possible. And so I mentioned I was able to benefit from my experience with the NRC for 6 years in a memorandum of understanding, MOU. And this chart right here is something I wanted to share with you all because it's sort of where people are comfortable with. And I think, any of these agencies on the left here could look at this chart and be like, okay, this I have a variation of this chart to some extent. And the idea here is that, you've got a lot of things that you're comfortable with, and you start to identify the comfortable with up on the top. And the top level here, they might not be unique to a specific AMT, but they're still saying, that there's an AMT regulatory application. So we've already identified this in advanced manufacturing technology. So we've singled it out. And then we're going to single out a lot of these things in some way, shape, or form. What makes them advanced, that's going to really depend on the agency's interpretation. I'll get through that in a couple minutes. And then for each AMT, whether it's a technology or a process, you've got additional testing or maybe a part with a particular AMT. And so this is an approach that they're trying to take, where they're trying to build some general comfort with this. What do they mean by advanced, and what do they consider advanced? What are these things that are giving people challenges for the qual cert? So they're trying to establish some general qual comfort there, and then go into further details when it gets into getting to process specific, material specific, or something like that. And so this is sort of the general approach that these agencies are taking to these advanced manufacturing technologies. And we'll go and step through and what does that look like for these different agencies in the next couple of slides. 1 second. Sorry, I'm actually on vacation right now.
Well, thank you for being here still. Appreciate that.
No, of course. I mean, I agreed to this 6 months ago when you first asked, and so things just fall into place where they fall into place.
Appreciate you.
And so, what I wanted to do here is look at the what is NASA doing. And so this slide first came out from I first borrowed the slide from a 2020 version of this presentation that one of my colleagues gave, and when we were educating the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on what different folks were doing for the qual cert processes. And at the time, they didn't have a lot of these advanced manufacturing singled out. NASA didn't. They were just coming with it. But now that has been done. And so, when we see NASA standard 6016, it's an Yeah. It's an overarching standard guidance that's been developed by NASA that does that top part. It starts looking at that top part, how NASA is going to approach these advanced manufacturing technologies, right? And so it starts looking at, what do we need to control in general? What are our concerns are? What are things that need to be done? And here we see, maybe some subtractive machining. So maybe when we're looking at robotics, composites, welding in the sense of 3D printing and additive manufacturing. And then we got some specific standards looking at like NASA standard 6030. And so that's going below that line. That's going technology specific, right? So there we get some guidance specifically to additive manufacturing. And so, we have hardware classification, process control, different idea of what the parameters are that are varying things and what's going on. So NASA has really been a leader in the space for years. They came out with some early guidance early on. They've done a lot with material standards. They've done a lot with materials management and design standards. So they've been one of the leaders coming out with guidance and general guidance for a decade now. So when we don't want to see what the current state is. These folks, they've understood that, things are changing. They've understood that people are making, weight cost money out of manufacturing is a great way to do some lightweighting, looking at assemblies and component reductions, being able to go from something that's, a ton of components to less components. A lot of the advantages offered by the advanced manufacturing and additive manufacturing, NASA's recognized that and they've developed guidance. They've been really good about getting that guidance out. So there's a couple of documents right there that are starting points for people that want to do something and work with the space agencies. I should note that, NASA, FAA, and EASA are really in a lot of this together. So the FAA, here's a couple of subsections looking at the FAA guidance under their Code of Federal Regulations. And so they start looking at materials fabrication and test of material. And so here again is that general approach. And so they don't want to lock you down. And they do their best to focus on the idea that they're coming out with a process with a component or a part or something that they can have confidence in. And they do their best to not restrict, well, the process. And so that, excuse me, they want to support innovation. They want people to be able to use new fabrication methods, to use new technologies. And so they want to, and they do the best they can provide paths where people can demonstrate, their new part with their novel technology, with their new material by breaking it down to material and methods and parts. And so, that goes into that different, ways of doing qualification by breaking it into, the part and the material and the process. What happens though with some of the advanced manufacturing technologies is that some of the, demonstrating this as a single entity, as a single group, a single organization can be detrimental, right? It can be too much. If you're a small startup wanting to get something done and you're working with the FAA and you've got to demonstrate that your fabrication method is substantiated by a test program, that might be a lot if you have like a brand novel fabrication method that nobody's really used before. And so, when people get together and they start to develop guidance on these things, that's great. So this is there, and these options are there when you have that capability, when you have that able to do some of these heavy lifts, but not everybody's able to do those types of things. So the FAA actually they have issue papers. And so the issue papers are necessary, or they're offered necessary to provide a structured means, comes in necessary type of certification, type of validation process. And so, this gets into going into a little bit more of the advanced manufacturing. So they've done some papers for the advanced manufacturing technologies like additive manufacturing. And so they'll issue these papers that provide some additional guidance into how you can meet some of these steps that they're requiring. And so they still provide and they do their best to stick to this overarching, this applies to everything, but they want to give the ability to kind of adopt and use, allow for those groups to work together and have some repeatability and consistency in how these overarching guidance are applied. And that's where we start to see some of these issues papers. So the FDA is a little, so my arrow stopped working every once in a while here. So the FDA is going into, a little bit differently. Again, they have some of these basic overarching, this is the guidance that we provide. And so, they've started, and the FDA has done something similar to the issue papers where they've started to create some documentation on, here's what we expect to see, what we want to see for additive manufacturing. So the FDA was a little bit behind NASA. FAA was definitely behind NASA. FDA probably came out within the past 5 years, they come out with guidance specific to additive. There's different types of advanced manufacturing technologies as well. And so, we're starting to see some of these here, the same sort of overarching guidance with the CFR, but looking at specific sections that address advanced manufacturing. And, so similar to what's being done by NASA, what's being done by the FAA, is the FDA is they're giving this overarching guidance that this is the guidance that you use to certify a part, to qualify a part for us, for our administration. And here is some additional guidance if you're using an advanced manufacturing technology. And so a lot of times, again, they can give that capability to use your one-off approach and work with them. They do have people that you can work with to help, develop and mature your process to make sure it's going to comply with what their requirements are. But they also provide guidance on different advanced manufacturing technologies, so you don't have to do all the heavy lifting yourself. You can adopt and utilize this new guidance that's emerging that's going to help you kind of fall into and figure out, how you can better conform to what their emerging guidance is on these advanced manufacturing technologies. So this last one I want to talk about was the NRC. And so the NRC, I mentioned, these are some folks that I've given some joint presentations with the NRC folks talking about their quality cert challenges and what they're doing. So I'm very familiar with their process. And recall that first diagram that I put in the first aspect of looking at the regulations and the regulatory authorities. And so they're very much taking across, they're doing advanced manufacturing technologies. And so all these groups are doing advanced manufacturing technology. And so they don't necessarily want to have new guidance for everything, but they are acknowledging that there's a lot of challenges that people are facing with the certain technologies of manufacturing, and that they're having challenges meeting the guidance as has been long written, long understood. And so they're emerging, and new guidance is emerging. I should have mentioned, FAA, they have something called the MMPDS. And so MMPDS is a handbook that allows you to look at a material in a process and get a part. So FAA acknowledging that some of these processes are different as doing MMPDS Volume 2. And so Volume 2, it goes into a lot more process specification. And so the idea there is it's not this process, it's this process. And so it tries to better accommodate some of the challenges that people run into with these, showing that their qualification, showing their part or showing their process can be qualified, can be certified, can be accepted. And so these agencies, they acknowledge this, and they're finding ways to try to better work with people, provide different guidance, better guidance for some of these unique advanced manufacturing technologies. So here's an example of some of the stuff that the NRC is doing. And so here's some of these overarching guidelines where you have 10 CFR 5059, 5055 A codes and standards. And so these are books, and they're literally just books and guidance. They're going to tell you, specification, these are things and how you might qualify or certify your part. And so, just like these other ones, they have this overarching guideline that's kind of allowed people to develop their parts, their processes to meet their codes. They're finding that the advanced manufacturing processes are creating a challenge. And so these codes are now looking at, all right, these are our basic regulations that people need to follow. They do something called code cases. And so they've worked, and here I have ASME, they've worked with ASME and their codes and code cases. And the code cases provide viable path forward for doing the showing how certain products or product families can meet a code. And so they will work with the consensus standards. So NRC leverages the ASME standards quite a bit and ASME codes because they have nuclear codes and boiler and pressure vessel codes that are very relevant to the NRC. And so what they have done is they've started developing code cases specific to additive manufacturing, as for one example. But they also they've put on these workshops now for over a decade on advanced manufacturing technologies where they're constantly learning from people and learning, what challenges they're having. I mean, I don't know how familiar with most of you are with the nuclear, but nuclear is, very, very risk averse for many years. We haven't seen a lot of, new nuclear come out in a long time. These SMRs, small modular reactors, I was reading yesterday that they just laid the base for the first SMR in the Western world in Canada, like a couple weeks ago. And these things have been in development from the 80s, since the 80s, like NuScale, to develop these small modular reactors that can power, 300,000, 500,000 homes. But there's just been how do you get there in a safe way that every people are comfortable with? And it's taken decades. And so, it's not only is it new designs, but it's building up that comfort with the process and what's going on. And so, the NRC folks, they're aware of that they need to be risk averse, and so they're aware of some of the challenges people have in meeting their guidelines as they're written, and so they continue to work with people to develop the code cases and develop new guidance for advanced manufacturing technologies. And there was actually just recently, this past year, because of a lot of the calls for the new energy sources, something put out by Congress, a new line to actually ask for, better to streamline a lot of these regulatory processes and specifically look at better guidance in manufacturing. And so, the NRC has been affected a little bit by some of the reorganization in the government last year, or I should say a little bit, quite a bit. But they still have this guidance and they have these mandates that said, figure it out, figure out how we can incorporate these advanced manufacturing processes to streamline our production and our manufacturing of these new pieces of equipment. And so, all of these agencies, they realize that, these aren't one size fit all. They all provide methods for doing one-off, here's our part, here's our unique process. We're going to demonstrate confidence, demonstrate those repeatability and reproducibility and stability qualities that I talked about earlier. But they're all also doing their best to figure out how they can better leverage, and grow the knowledge of these technologies, and so they can provide better guidance to the people that are using these technologies. So as I mentioned, I wanted to put one more NRC slide. So this one goes a little bit beyond the codes that they're using and different ways of doing the and providing the guidance, but it talks about, they're having these assessment panels, they're doing a lot of guidance, they're doing these codes and workshops, and they're doing reports. And I left this one here because it feeds into, this is on advanced manufacturing technologies. They talk about advanced manufacturing technologies. One of the ones, and again, this is why I'm here, that technologies that is really pushing this advanced manufacturing technology concepts is additive manufacturing, because of the variability, because of the complexity of the processes and technologies using additive manufacturing. And so a lot of these agencies, they don't want to develop guidance for additive manufacturing, but additive manufacturing has really forced the subject on a lot of these agencies because of the challenges with getting that repeatability, that reproducibility, and the stability. And so, a lot of this new guidance and advanced manufacturing technology has really come out in the last decade and has been pushed real hard by the capabilities of the additive manufacturing processes. So I'm going to jump into the additive manufacturing section of the next slide. But quickly, again, I'll take a pause and see if anybody has any questions. I mean, so is anybody not comfortable with or have any different thoughts about here? These are how I prepared the regulatory and the idea of what drives the qual cert from the acceptance authorities. And so these are the ones that I chose to kind of demonstrate the acceptance authorities. I mean, they don't have to be government agencies. They could be, the American Bureau of Shipping, different sort of NIR, different folks that are doing some certification processes, but they're all going to have, it's different guidance for some of these advanced manufacturing technologies. And that's also going to kind of conclude like why we care about qual and cert and acceptance. So, my understanding is some of y'all, you know, want to do a part, want to do something, but they don't not quite sure what you have to conform to or what guidance is available. And so, I hope this kind of gave a flavor of the type of stuff that you might run into.
Any questions?
Okay.
So I had a quick question. I'm sorry.
So
How do you get part qualifications done for technologies which are not adopted as widely? For example, in this, you're mentioning wire arc DED, for example. Let's say if you're working with some patented process, which is by a single manufacturer, what happens in that case, and how can we get some of those qualifications done in a expeditious manner if possible?
So, for one, you got to identify who's your target audience. So, who's doing the qualification? Who's providing that guide? Who's going to be the final authority that's going to give you the ANA? So, identify, what are the obstacles that you have to overcome, and who's providing that guidance? So, I showed you that each of those agencies, they have their own guidance. They don't have their own interpretation. There's overlap in there, but they all have their own guidance, and they all have their own, thou shalls. This is how we do it. So that would be one. Two might be, is your process novel or your process parameters novel, right? And so is there, there are YRDD standards that are being developed right now under ASME and under AWS and under ASTM, right? And so knowing that these standards are coming out, can you leverage some of that standard and say, listen, I'm following this standard. They might say that standard's not good enough, which unfortunately is a reality. But can you point to standards that show, "Well, this is what my process is based on, and here's me showing I meet that standard." And so you really have to first identify who's your authority that you need to, show that you can meet what their conditions are. And two, you have to be able to say, here's how I'm meeting that. And that becomes part of working with that authority and also maybe going into the standards body. And so if it's something where many people are facing the same challenge, can you start the standards effort in there? And that's what a lot of the folks are doing for the NRC side of things. And that's why you're seeing a lot of movement in ASME with additive manufacturing standards because the NRC is driving that. Groups like EPRI, different nuclear groups need to have these components made and qualified, and so going to standards organizations to help build a consensus knowledge base. So those are kind of your two options there, but you really do have to start with, who's that person that's going to say this is good or this is not, and work with them to figure out what is their guidance requiring, and leverage standards as much as you can. And I'm going to jump into that in the additive manufacturing section. Does that help at all?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So, I guess I'm already 50 minutes in. So I think I've got it. I mean, we've taken questions along the way, but it looks like we've got 35 minutes left.
We have about 22.
Yeah, 25. All right, math good. Yeah, I was going to 9:50. Oh, all right, I got you.
Yeah, we end at 9.
All right. So advanced manufacturing and additive manufacturing. So building trust in additive manufacturing, no established consistent way for others to improve product value with AIM technology. So I mentioned this, we talked about those other quotes. There's a lot of different people acknowledge additive manufacturing, one of the advanced manufacturing technologies is different, has a lot of variability. That stability, that repeatability, that reproducibility, it's not there in general for additive manufacturing where we can just point to it. And you under certain conditions, if you box in these conditions, you can demonstrate it, but it's difficult to just say, I'm using additive manufacturing, okay, you're good to go. And so being a digital manufacturing process, there's a lot of data opportunities. And so the question is, how do we get there in additive manufacturing, really pushing the boundaries of these advanced manufacturing technologies. And so this for me is kind of like that one of the more challenging ones that regulators and the authoritative, the approval agencies are dealing with. And so this is one that, when you think about your process, hopefully this one's harder than what you're using. If it is your process, then hopefully this can help you understand, give you some insight into what you might want to do. So out of manufacturing, hundreds of parameters and variables. So this, again, it's just, why is it hard? There's a lot of variability. You want confidence, you want no uncertainty, you want repeatability, you want consistency. Variability, it impedes consistency, it impedes confidence, it impedes consistency. And so, out of manufacturing, you've got the materials, the equipment, and all sorts of different things that are feeding and creating that variations. You get your control system, your fusion, your coding, your build environment, your operator, your instructions, your feedstock, and even how the system is built. One powder bed fusion system is different than another powder bed system. So we've done lots of studies and more studies in that showing just how people are using the same hardware implemented differently, resulting in different parts and different variations. And so what are the implications? Changes in how you represent your information, as simple as build file. Here are my instructions in creating my part. Different machines might implement and incorporate those instructions differently. It creates a variation. Feedstock variability, if you've got different morphologies, you've got different powder size distributions, changes in those can lead to different properties. Simple as moving your part someplace different in a build platform can change your property. And I apologize. I just realized I don't have an introduction to additive manufacturing in this. I'm assuming we're all familiar with additive manufacturing, but layer by layer advanced manufacturing technology. My background is more in the powder bed fusion. We've done a little bit with the DED stuff as well. Does anybody have any questions about additive manufacturing before I jump forward? Okay. So, keep moving there. And so there's a lot of variability that creates a lot of challenges. And again, in establishing consistency, repeatability, and reproducibility. So what are the implications of qualification? A lot of these qualification methods that we've seen, they just said, say use the same process and you're good. But the variations in the feedstock, the variations in the recoding system, the variations in the laser power, the variations in the location on it all create inconsistency in the final material properties. And so when your task as a final thing is saying, well, show me as you get the same material properties over and over again, you can do that if you can get everything else the exact same over and over again. But as soon as you get a new material feedstock, as soon as you change your design and change your design back, as soon as you change your machine and try to use a different manufacturer, you lose that repeatability. And so, that creates challenges in how we do qualification certification. And so here, in this section, I'm going to look a little bit more what's what are we looking at? What are we looking towards? And so here's, the current one I would say is closely to I mentioned the lockdown approach. And so this is looking at, locking down the subsystem components. And so we're more and more able to do that and understand that the overall system can do this over and over again. And by locking subsystems, you can, as long as you understand the implications, you can demonstrate the implications of changing that subsystem, then you can move forward and continue to show that you've met certain criteria. What the emerging ones I wanted to talk about was that, and this is fairly mature now, and so we're seeing standards in this, and there's the IQ, OQ, PQ, MQ. And so here are some standards, examples of some of the standards that are being used. And so there are some new standards that aren't addressed here that are developing out of ASTM and are developed out of SAE as well. And that's looking at, here the installation qualification. What are the capabilities of your machine? Does your machine have these basic capabilities, and to what extent can these capabilities be met? The OQ, the operational qualification, and that's the idea of, can your machine, continuously meet these capabilities? Can you control and show repeatability in your operation? Can you show repeatability in your process? And so there are standards that are emerging there. 52930 and SAE AMS 7032. So both these standards have just come out in the last couple of years. And this is, really a potential path forward that the regulatory agencies and the certification authorities have not necessarily said, yes, this is what we're doing. But these approaches right here, this IQOP, OQ, PQ, MQ, are definitely moving the needle as far as being able to make people comfortable with those concepts that I talked about. I can reproduce the process, I can repeat this process, I've got process stability. The qualification approach and the PQ and the material qualification. There's a MQ material qualification, one for maintenance qualification as well. So here the idea of having consistency in the feedstock. And again, there's breaking down this into subsystems components that show and the standards being developed around these things that say, this is how we can say, as long as the material meets the requirements, as long as the process meets the requirements, as long as the process is able to do this over and over again, I'm comfortable in saying that this is a qualified operation, qualified process, a qualified installation, a qualified material, a qualified performance. And so this is something that the standards are being developed right now for, and there's been some success in developing those standards and pushing these types of approaches. And so that's something that I would heavily encourage you to look to, if you're having some challenges with looking at, this qual cert process is looking at IQ, OQ, PQ, MQ, and what that means in your particular application or by your certification authority. And again, that's the idea of removing variability to some sense by focusing on specific aspects of things and leveraging the standards that are being developed in these areas, because these are actively emerging standards in these areas. Qualification for a part family qualification. This is an emerging area. Here, the WK means that there's a work item is actively involved. So the standards that are emerging here, and that's the family sense. And so I know there are folks that are more and more interested in this type of approach. And so current qualification approaches are requiring the same thing over and over and over again. But when we make design modifications, we have to requalify something. Do we need to requalify every time we make a slight design modification? So this part family approach is something that different folks are looking at, different agencies are looking at as well, to kind of better understand what other times where we can say you didn't make a drastic overhaul. The IQ, OQ, and PQ are still the same. The performance is slightly different. You can keep those, and we're going to put this in the part family, and this is what the new expectations are. And so there's emerging guidance there. And so that's something to keep an eye on. This is going a little bit, further ahead in the future. And this is looking at zone-based qualification. And so similar to part family, maybe one aspect of that is saying, well, this is my family is based on this platform. And here's the zone that this platform is made out of. So I'm going to keep on qualifying this platform over and over again. In these other things that are changing that aren't on my Common Core platform, those are the things that I'm going to do additional qualification on. And so that's something, you can see there's no standard efforts there, but that's something that folks are looking at as a potential, how do we move forward with some of these advanced and additive manufacturing technologies, is identifying that common platform and then focusing on the things that maybe you need additional inspection, or maybe that's a highly critical area that needs the additional inspection. Repeatability and reproducibility. So this is some work that we had done earlier on, and this is something that I'm interested in, and that's more of looking at a lot of times we do the qual cert where we're looking at, okay, we're getting into material qualification. We're still doing and testing those parts. One of the things I haven't talked about yet in this additive manufacturing is the data that we're generating in additive manufacturing and using that data. And so additive manufacturing and digital manufacturing process, we can observe every step of the process. We can observe the material being created. We can observe all sorts of aspects about the process, the melt pool, and in the case of laser powder bed fusion, we can observe the location of where the material is being created. And so the question is, can we leverage any of that? And so one of the things that we were looking at is adoption of the systems V model. And so here are some emerging things that other people are looking at, the model-based type of things. And so here is looking, focused on the modeling simulation. So a lot of efforts that are going on there now, particularly when you go to the type of qualification approaches that look for bridging the materials to the process and the process performance. And so if you're looking at bridging the materials to the process, so the material structure relationship, material process structure relationship, you might want to look at the simulation. So, with additive manufacturing, we know a lot of the end game comes into the microstructure. And so can we use simulation? There's efforts going on there. Can we use simulation to get insight to the microstructure? And then how can leverage, group and development and standards there to support the qualification and certification? Also, and that's we're looking at, I think one of the efforts that we have in this area is doing in the um, IQCAM. And the other thing, of course, is in situ monitoring. And that's where a lot of my interest in the digital twins lie. If we have all this data and we're observing the process, we should be able to observe that the process is repeatable, that we've repeated that process. Can we use our quote unquote digital shadow, digital twin of the part we just created and say, here's our data set that's representative of the part. Let's interrogate the data instead of the part because this is representative of everything that's happened in the process. So there's a lot of effort. There's actually a joint FAA EASA group that's looking at how can we better use in situ information to support our qual-cert processes. So these are some directions that folks are heading in the future in better understanding how to incorporate the data from the process, the data from the design and early on into facilitating and supporting that qual-cert process. So it's actually not done yet, but folks are looking more and more on how to incorporate that. And there's a lot of ongoing efforts there. So, moving there, maturing the process environment. I'm sorry, I'm trying to speed along here. I ran out of time real quick talking about the basis. There are a lot of efforts going on. We do a lot of work in NIST, and that would be my last couple of minutes here. A lot of standards efforts, MMPDS and different standards bodies, SAE, ASTM, that are developing. Here's the ASTM IQ, OQ, PQ standards that are developing these standards to support these qualification efforts. And there are also different groups. I just mentioned the EASA group. There's a Delta Qual program going on in America Makes now. There's AM Forward. And so for additive manufacturing, there's different groups that are saying, okay, we need to come to some common understanding of what is qualified. So like AM Forward is trying to get these LSIs, the large systems integrators, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, to say, as long as you create a part like this, then meeting these certifications, and that's my base qualification. That's okay to some extent. And so they're looking for this common acceptance criteria across some of these LSIs, because what happens is tier 2, tier 1 suppliers are facing something where they're qualifying to one LSI and qualifying to another LSI, and they all have different requirements. And so there are efforts that are looking at, how do we qualify and get a better understanding? A lot of these efforts, supported by the guidance. So I talked about the guidance already. You've got Navy guidance, NASA guidance, FAA guidance, FDA guidance. And so here NRC guidance, American Bureau of Shipbuilding guidance. And so here I mentioned, and there's actually an article that came up right when I was creating this one. Here I mentioned, there are these dedicated guidance documents coming out, whether it's for advanced manufacturing technology or additive manufacturing technologies. Here's, and these are all just come out in the past 2 or 3 years. So if you're doing advanced manufacturing and you want to, meet some qualification, want to meet some authority, look for the specific guidance documents that are coming out now. And all these documents are underpinned and supported by standards. And so, this is where I work, this is where a lot of folks are working. How do we use the guidance documents? The guidance documents want to point standards. 10 years ago, there was maybe 10 standards to point to. Now there's closer to like 150, 100 so that you can point to. We just did the JAMWIG for the Joint Additive Manufacturing Group, the Department of War, just did a study looking at all of the standards available to additive manufacturing, and they went through 130 or so, and they looked at which ones could they adopt right now. They only felt they could adopt a small subset of all the standards they went through, which speaks to, we still need to mature our standards in these technologies. But the point is, they know the need to adopt those standards, and they went through a process they solicited input from the community on what standards should be adopted. So these standards and these efforts are underpinning a lot of this guidance for Qual-Cert. With that said,
Paul, when these come out, are they all on the NIST website?
No.
How do you search for them effectively?
Right now, there's actually something very nice that's been going on for additive manufacturing specifically for the past decade. The Additive Manufacturing Standards Collaborative. So it's co-hosted by America Makes and ANSI, and that's what you see in this top right corner. The last version was April 2025. I'm actually on the advisory committee for these folks. And what they've done is they've looked at all these organizations making additive manufacturing standards, and they've published this is a 200-page document on all the different, if you want to look up a topic, it's usually in this document. But there's been different people that have talked about, creating a resource, and ANSI has been one of them, of all the available additive manufacturing standards, but there is still no go-to. I'm going to go see all these standards. And so you have to know who the players are. You have to know AWS, you have to know SAE, you have to know ASTM, ISO, you have to know ASME. And so you have to know, those are the IEC to some extent. Those are the folks that are involved. But this is a great place to start, this ANSI America makes, if you're interested in learning more about the additive standards.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. And you know what? I'm just going to scroll through NIST here because I'm out of time. But additive manufacturing at NIST is I've got a few slides here. For those you aren't familiar, again, I talked about the design, the material, machine production, and finally, qualification and certainties. And so there's a lot of certainty without this, throughout the entire life cycle. And what we do at NIST is we do measurement science. This and talks about our partnerships. We do measurement science, and so we do traceability a lot of times. We help address that uncertainty through either how you present the information, how you measure things, how you observe things. That's what we do. So we have 3,400 employees. It's shrunk a little bit. Associates have shrunk a little bit more. I wanted to put out, we do manufacturing USA and MEPs, and so the manufacturing USA, that's something where, that's I've engaged with IBI at this point. We coordinate the Manufacturing USA Institutes at NIST through our Office of Advanced Manufacturing. So we work closely with many of these institutes as well. We have Manufacturing MEP. That's been a little bit being re-envisioned a little bit right now. And so it's evolving as it was, but it's traditionally we have an MEP partnership center in every state in Puerto Rico, and that's a direct link to NIST by they're contractors, but they directly link to NIST and to our central MEP, and it's a way for people to access NIST resources. So I wanted to point out those things if you're not familiar with both of them. And so I'm from the labs. And so we have two main campuses in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is where I'm headquartered. I'm in Massachusetts right now, though, and in Boulder, Colorado. So that's where a lot of our research goes. A lab breakdown talks a little bit more about barriers in additive manufacturing. We have several labs. Engineering lab is where I'm from. We also work with materials measurement lab, physical measurements lab, and all these different folks to really do that fundamental measurement science that I was talking about. And some of our facilities, so we have the machines, we've built our own additive manufacturing machines that are really sort of on the high end side doing our basic high end research. And here's an example of some of our research that we've been working on. And I wanted to show, how it's leading to standards. And so, we talked a little bit about the qual and cert, a lot about the qual cert. I was going over time right now. All these different standards they're all being developed in different areas, but they all end up kind of fundamentally underpinning different parts of QualCert. Again, whether it's through better representation of the information for being able to do some sort of observation or analytics against, whether it's better measurements to reduce the uncertainty in the material or in the process or in the design. A lot of these efforts kind of, fit into those QualCert activities. And you see they're really underpinned by our measurement science capabilities and the things that we're able to do because of NIST. So, advanced manufacturing allows granular sensory and observation process part interactions. And so, that kind of underpins what we're doing at NIST is being able to create that granularity through the modeling information, through the high fidelity measurements, through the observations. And so, ideally, the way these advanced manufacturing call certs are heading is more towards, hey, because they're advanced, we now know so much more about how they were created than we do with the traditional process. We don't have that same knowledge base where we have, hundreds and hundreds of years and decades of experience, but we know everything that's going on in these processes. And so, some of these approval agencies are starting to think like that and starting to understand that. Takeaways: advanced manufacturing concept that covers various different manufacturing technologies, though a common theme is the novelty of the processes. Technology evolved toward full maturation. Knowledge about the underlying processes continuously be improved. So it's all about, the standard knowledge, working with standards, working communities, working with experts, and building those consensus. Continuous improvement of process capabilities continue to inform the certification landscape. So we're seeing new guidance come out for these advanced manufacturing technologies. We're seeing new standards underpin them. And we're seeing new steps that are being taken to help with the qual cert and some of these advanced manufacturing processes. And I hope I at least gave you a starting point. And I'll give you all the slides. So if you want to know more about all the specifics and what NIST is doing, feel free to jump into those last slides. But I guess hopefully I did for you all, met some of what you're expecting, hearing more about, what is the qual insert about and who's doing what there and what it means for different people and different technologies and under the context of advanced manufacturing. And so I guess I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Paul. This
You're welcome.
was great and so much information. So did you say you would be able to share the slides or a portion of the slides? That would be great too as well. We're right up on 9 o'clock here if anybody needs to hop, but maybe a minute or two for last minute questions. Go ahead and ask them now. Oh, it's funny.
Thank you.
All right. Well, feel free to email me. If you do have questions that you think of, I'll send out the slides and I will either ask you directly, Paul, or I don't know how you're comfortable with questions after the fact.
No, I mean, I work at NIST, at NIST, our sole mission is to kind of underpin and help
Okay.
push up US industry. So part of my job is always to answer questions, interact, collaborate. So by any means, if you have any questions, shoot them my way and I'll do my best to answer the best I can.